I want to just begin with your sense of where we stand right now, particularly with the breaking news just in the last hour that there's been an issue for a CN rail strike notice.
Yeah, I heard all the conversation. It was excellent. The one thing I think that we really need to center is the health and safety, that this isn't about how farmers are going to be 2 weeks from now. It's about Canadians need to ask themselves, how do you feel about hazardous goods going through your community by rail, sorry. How do you feel if the workers are saying they're not getting enough rest, if they don't have enough sleep for turnaround times? How do you feel if the workers are saying this isn't safe? That's the crux of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can't allow business interests to be generalized as our own interests, because my interest is rail safety for the trains that go through my community, and the trains definitely go through Maple Ridge, and I'm sure they go through a majority of the communities of people who are watching right now.
John-Henry, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because it really just reminds us, because so much of the conversation has been about money. And not to say money isn't important, but at the heart of it, this is about workers, laborers having a dispute with their employers and not being able to reach an agreement. So I don't want to lose sight of that in our discussion. And I wonder, to you, what are the sticking points? Like, why has it been so difficult for the Teamsters and these two rail lines to meet somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I think the Teamsters have identified the sticking point really well. And as you pointed out, they're saying, hey, let's get back to the table. So the sticking point, unfortunately, does bring us back to money. And CN and CPKC are for-profit corporations. And they're going to come out and their spokespeople are going to talk about Canadian interests and Canadian goods. And we have to get these goods to market as if they're a public service, but they're not. They are for-profit companies. And I did an interview about this a couple days ago. I looked at the stock prices for both companies. Stocks were up. Listened to the radio on the way home yesterday, and the news talked about the lockouts and then talked about the stock prices for CN and CPKC, and they went up. So the sticking point is the companies just want to increase their profits. They're pressuring their workers to keep unsafe hours, because the more hours one worker works, instead of hiring, let's say, two or giving them more rest time, they increase their profits. So they're pressuring workers, and the price of that, unfortunately, is going to be rail disasters. If we allow corporations to put profit before our community safety, we're in huge trouble.
So much I want to dig into with that answer, sir. So you mentioned that it's a good reminder. These are for-profit companies, but there's been a lot of discussion about whether rail in this country should be deemed, these rail lines in particular, should be deemed as essential services. And if one were to do that, does that mean it becomes a federally run organization? Like, how do we meet somewhere in the middle? Would it be ideal if this was an essential service and therefore in some capacity governed by the federal government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. When Chamber of Commerce or Board of Trades or whatever say it should be essential service, probably what they mean is therefore we can force workers back to work and have essential staffing, right?
Exactly,
that's probably
yes.
what they mean. But I can meet them halfway and say, yeah, this is essential. Let's make CN a crown corporation again. From 1919 to 1995, we owned CN Rail. It was a crown corporation, and then it was privatized. So if we all agree, rail is essential, we can't allow this kind of thing to happen again. So let's not just make it an essential service, let's make it a crown corporation. It was one, it was successful. And by the way, then let's expand passenger service too. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but business loves to get ahead of themselves and say, look, the sky is falling. You're not going to be able to get your Cheerios at the grocery store if this continues, when we're, one day into it?
You mentioned earlier the issue of safety, and that safety is so critical in this conversation. Some might argue that it is the union at this point that is potentially compromising safety because there are so many materials. But hear me out. This is the thing that's out there, like
I know that some people, and by some people, let's be clear, it's the Canadian Federation of Independent Business.
it's other people. People are like, hey,
Commerce.
look, I can't get medications, pharmacy stuff. It's not getting out to the pharmacists. We just had a conversation yesterday that chlorine is not getting to municipalities, which could in a few days impact our drinking water. So I hear you. This has primarily been an industry or business argument, but there is some concern. Hey, are the Teamsters, are the unions doing enough to get to some sort of middle ground? Because right now, if they're on strike, then definitely the pressure will be on them to make a move.
Yeah, for sure. No, and the only reason I smiled or laughed a little bit is because these same groups, it's all the usual suspects, every single strike. Whatever it is, they want a consumer is king frame and say, look at the big bad union. And the interesting thing about like endangering your safety, endangering your right to happiness and shop whenever you want. But the funny thing about this is up until what I want to say 12 hours ago, this was a law. Well, actually, it still is a lockout, right? Like the strike notice has only been served. So this absolutely isn't on the unions. And anyone saying the Teamsters are doing X, Y, or Z to you and your safety or your happiness are missing the point that a lockout is CN and CPKC were saying we're going to lock our workers out. So it isn't the union at this point. It's CN. CPK, sorry, I'm having trouble saying those four letters.
No, don't worry,
together.
everybody is. Yeah.
So they put their boots on our neck with a lockout, and they're saying, look how bad the unions are threatening you. But it was them. They locked their workers out, and they're not willing to bargain. So we have to put the pressure and the focus on these for-profit rail companies, because honestly, at this point, that's not even ideological. That's just facts that they're the ones who have caused this.
What should be the role of the federal government in all of this?
Honestly, I feel like, because I'm a historian as well, I'm a labor historian, and I feel like we've gone back to the time of robber barons, like where these greedy railway barons are threatening us and our rail safety and workers. And I think what the federal government needs to do is force collective bargaining, not binding arbitration, put pressure on the companies to actually come to agreement, and then allow this to be a larger conversation about how important, if everybody's saying rail is really important. Same thing we said about the ports in Vancouver last summer, right around now. So we need to have conversations about nationalizing vitally important industries, making them crown corporations, and not allowing profiteering and the rise of the, again, of robber railway barons.
John-Henry, let me ask you for a clarification, because a lot of folks, myself included, get lost in the language, the lockout versus the strike, right? But in this instance, you said they should be pushing for collective bargaining and not binding arbitration. What is the distinction between those two things?
Good question. So binding arbitration is you have an arbitrator, both sides put their proposals. So the railway company, CN on the one hand and CPKC on the other, they'll say, okay, this is what our last proposal to the workers was, to the union. And the union says, this was our last proposal, because that's where they're butting heads, right? They're not meeting and negotiating between the two proposals. So the arbitrator has the right to decide, okay, on pay, we're going to give you this much pay, whatever each side has asked for. The arbitrator decides, generally speaking, they're supposed to, I think, meet them halfway and say, here's a compromise agreement. And the thing is, it doesn't go back to the membership for a vote. The company doesn't get to say, no, we don't like that. It's binding. So this is your collective agreement for, let's say, the next 2 or 3 years. So really, they're just kicking the can down the road and saying, we have resolved this for now. We're forcing both parties to accept this.
Okay.
Collective bargaining is both parties sitting down and hashing it out. negotiating, compromising, perhaps, and literally coming to a collectively agreed upon agreement, a collective agreement.
Thank you very much for that explanation. Thank you very much for your insights today. I'm so glad we got to speak.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.
Our pleasure. John-Henry Harter, thank you.